Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine for a moment the world's first inflatable church.
An inflatable church.
Yeah, it's a real thing, like 47 feet high, inflatable altar, pews, even stained glass. A BBC story covered it.
Wow, okay.
And the material we're diving into today sort of kicks off by asking, is that what we mean by church planting?
Probably not quite right. I think the sources we're looking at have a more foundational idea in mind, less portable, maybe.
Definitely less portable.
Yeah.
So welcome, everyone, to this deep dive. We've got some really interesting excerpts here digging into what is a church and how to plant one.
And specifically looking at contexts that are, well, challenging, resistant even.
Exactly. So our mission today is to pull out the key insights. We'll look at the practical side, the how-to of starting a group of believers.
And also the really fundamental question of what actually is a church, according to these sources.
And it's worth saying up front, the material assumes we're talking about planting churches among what are often called unreached people groups.
Right? Places with no existing indigenous church from that culture.
And for these sources, planting churches in those contexts is the main goal, like the central thing. One quote says, if it's not your stated aim, it probably won't happen.
Intentionality is key.
Totally. So let's start where the sources do. How do you plant a church?
Well, first, they define pioneer church planting. It means starting from scratch, where no church from that specific group exists yet.
It doesn't just, pop up.
No, exactly. The source uses this image I found really striking. A church in an unreached place is like a turtle on a fence post.
Huh. Yeah, I remember that.
It didn't get there by itself, right? Someone had to deliberately put it there.
Intense intentionality.
And because of that, the sources stress starting with a concrete goal, something achievable.
Not just a, huge, vague dream of a movement someday.
Exactly. That comes later, maybe. But the initial goal they suggest is pretty specific.
Okay, what is it?
It's about getting a group of believers together from that people group. Needs a minimum size, some social variety.
So not just three best friends.
Right. And they need to be committed to Christ, obviously, but also to each other and to the Word.
Okay.
And ideally, under local leadership, elders from their own culture with a vision to reproduce, to plant more groups.
And a really interesting point they make is about starting new groups within the same background.
Yeah, like Hindu background believers meeting together or Muslim background believers, rather than trying to immediately slot them into, say, a Western-style church.
There's that quote from Sabama in India, wasn't it? About house churches growing naturally if the approach is flexible for Hindu converts.
Exactly. It respects their context, makes it feel like their church.
Now, you might wonder, isn't that initial goal a bit small? Shouldn't we aim for hundreds of churches right away?
Well, the sources tackle that directly. The big vision is good. You want that reproductive DNA from the start.
Yeah.
But having only a massive, seemingly impossible goal can actually paralyze you.
Yeah, I saw that. They called it a disease almost. Being okay with zero progress, because the only goal feels like it needs a miracle. So you just wait.
And they contrast that with this story from a place they call Shukranistan.
Right, tell us about that.
Well, this team, for years, their reports talked about aiming for hundreds of churches. But nothing was actually happening on the ground.
Okay.
Then a new leader came in and said, let's change our goal. Let's plan for the first church. Made it concrete, required personal evangelism.
And what happened?
Everything changed. Within a year, they had 2 growing fellowships.
Oh, wow. Just by changing the goal.
It seems like it energized them, made it real, something they could actually work towards and see God answer prayer for. The insight is that a concrete, achievable goal, even a small one, is the engine. Big, vague dreams can stall you out.
Okay, that makes sense. So you have this concrete goal. How do you actually get started? Where do the people come from?
Yeah, the sources are pretty blunt. You need believers to work with. So that usually means either you lead people to faith yourself, or you find existing believers who might be isolated. Or often a mix of both.
And the anecdotes here are really powerful, aren't they?
They really are. There's Eric and Carla in Indonesia, labored for ages and just met for us.
Yeah.
An existing believer from that group.
And that led to a church plant.
Yep. 20 believers within 18 months, just from that one connection.
It's incredible.
Or Michael in Central Asia, using literature, the Jesus film. He finds Fahmy.
Who was Fahmy?
An engineer. Came to faith study in Europe, just returned home with a real burden for his own people. He saw Michael's passion. They teamed up. The church they started grew to 150 people and started planting daughter churches.
Wow. It shows how God connects people.
Totally. And the author of one source had a similar story. 18 months, no fruit, then meets Farouk, a local guy who'd become a believer overseas. Their friendship sparked a group.
And wasn't there that detail about one guy in the group who used to be a fighter?
Oh, yeah, incredible detail. He had actually tried to kill Farouk previously.
Get out.
Seriously. The source just dryly says you have to overlook minor ups and downs. Talk about understatement.
No kidding. So finding existing believers is one way. What else?
Well, they also talk about starting intentionally with groups of non-believers.
Like listening groups.
Exactly. Gathering people to read the Gospels together, hoping they'll come to faith as a group. They mention the Kui people in India as an example of this group-based approach with a tribal people.
So kind of casting a wider net sometimes.
Yeah, or sometimes focusing very specifically on a family network, a clan. That can also lead to breakthroughs.
Like that story about Dawn and Carol with the Baran people.
Oh, that's a powerful one. A Baran believer, Bruce, introduced them to his extended family, including his brother Hank, who'd trained with the Taliban.
Whoa.
Took years of patient work. Then one morning, Hank has this dream. Christ appears, tells him men are coming, his family should listen.
Seriously, a dream.
That's what the source says. And the family did listen. The next day, the whole family was baptized.
The whole family.
The whole family clan. And it sparked a church among them, and even led to little fellowships, starting among 4 or 5 related people groups, some even across the border in another country.
That's just amazing. It really shows you never know the ripple effects, right?
Exactly. Simple obedience, sharing the news, investing in relationships. God does the surprising work. It's not always about finding believers first.
Okay, so let's say you do find some believers. Maybe 2, maybe more, but they don't know each other. How do you actually bring them together? Especially if meeting is risky.
Yeah, that's a big step. The sources say it takes real care, real patience.
Because of persecution risk, and maybe cultural stuff like trust issues in clan societies.
Both. Just saying, hey, let's all meet next Tuesday, usually isn't going to work right away.
So how do you approach it?
Yeah.
The sources mentioned a debate, right? Fishing in ponds versus casting wider nets.
Yeah, basically. Work within one family or social network. Or find scattered individuals and then try to connect them.
Which is better?
They kind of say the jury is still out. It depends so much on the context, how God seems to be leading. Both have challenges. Family dynamics can be messy. But limiting yourself to one network might miss people.
Okay, but regardless of how you find them, what helps pull these separate believers together?
Several things. Your relationship as the planter is often the initial glue.
You're the common link.
Exactly. Also, learning from the Bible that they're supposed to be in community, not alone, that's motivating.
And just the human need for support, I guess.
Yeah,
Especially if things are tough.
absolutely. Isolation is hard. Connection feels better, safer.
So the sources list 4 things to focus on when bringing people together.
Yeah, 4 key areas to nurture. First, keep teaching the biblical stuff about community,
Right.
why we need each other, what it looks like.
Okay, what else?
Second, comfort. Make those initial meetings feel safe, non-threatening,
Build trust slowly.
which is the third thing. Trust, absolutely vital.
And 4th,
Healthy interaction, helping them learn how to be a spiritual family, the one another stuff, encourage one another, build each other up.
so there's this pre-gathering phase.
Sort of. You might tell believers individually, hey, there are others. Keep teaching about community, maybe using Acts 2 or Ephesians 4, and then use non-threatening ways to actually introduce people.
Like what? How do you do that?
Well, what's almost universally non-threatening? Food. Parties.
Ah, okay. Meals together.
Exactly. Dinner parties, social gatherings in your home. Someone might refuse a meeting, but will often come for a meal. It's hospitality, right?
Makes sense. There was that story about the birthday party.
Yeah. Their regular fellowship meetings weren't working well, so they just threw a birthday party. Invited believers, seekers.
And people came.
Almost 25 people crammed into their apartment.
Wow.
And what's great is they made it clear it was a party, but they still included worship, prayer, time, and the Word.
And people were okay with that.
Apparently. Even a young believer, Tawfiq, who hadn't seemed that committed, he came and brought an unbelieving friend, knowing there'd be spiritual stuff.
Huh. So these events can mix social and spiritual naturally.
Yeah. Picnics, too. There's that funny story about the picnic where they forgot the grill.
Oh yeah, the pickup truck grill.
Mahmoud finds the front grill section of an old pickup at a junkyard to cook on. And even when it got dark, nobody wanted to leave. The fellowship was so good.
Great story. So eventually you hope the group wants to meet regularly.
That's the goal. Maybe they even suggest it. But it takes your influence, relationship, biblical truth, helping them overcome fear. And lots of prayer.
And meeting in an expat's home might not be ideal forever.
But a meeting is better than no meeting, right? Get started.
Okay, so then what? What happens when you actually get there? You have, say, 3 or more believers meeting regularly.
That's a huge milestone. The sources call it like phase V in the planting process. You're past just finding individuals.
It's a real group now.
Yeah. 3 isn't magic, but it's maybe a minimum for real community dynamics, the one another stuff, to start kicking in. Yeah. Getting there in a pioneer context, that's a huge achievement, huge potential.
That potential.
Yeah.
That story about the secret police officer really highlights it.
Oh, yeah. He tells Farouk, the local believer, that their tiny group was the first thing in 20 years that genuinely scared his department.
Just a small group of believers.
Tells you something about the power present when God's people actually form his body, doesn't it? Even small and vulnerable.
It really does. So once you have that regular group, what's the task?
It shifts. The sources mention a fourfold focus. 1, keep teaching the word intentionally. 2, shepherding, caring for them.
Okay.
3, actively developing that community life, New Testament body functions. And 4, identifying and developing potential local leaders.
And evangelism still continues, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The group keeps sharing. Maybe the planters look to start other groups. And of course, prayer undergirds everything. Praying for the sick is mentioned too. Huge topics they admit they don't fully cover.
Okay, so that's a lot on the practical how-to. Moving from goal setting to finding people, gathering them, nurturing that first group.
Right, so now the sources pivot to that other massive question. What is a church, anyway, biblically speaking?
They start with contextualization.
Yeah.
Fitting the church to the culture.
Exactly. The forms, the flavors, clothing, worship style, music, language, where and when you meet. Making it feel indigenous, like it belongs.
So Bama's quote again, fitting churches to the needs and culture is historical church practice.
Right. They even mentioned Buddhism adapting to China way back when.
But cultural fit isn't everything.
No. Important, yes, but biblical concerns are more important. The goal, they say, is a church where the only stumbling block is the cross of Christ itself.
Not weird foreign customs.
Exactly. And they acknowledge mistakes happen, but as planters step back, the church will naturally shed stuff that doesn't fit and find its own way.
So what is the biblical definition then?
Well, the main Greek word is ecclesia.
Ecclesia.
Shows up 114 times in the New Testament, almost always for church. It had roots in Jewish religious gatherings and Gentile public assemblies.
And it's used for the big universal church and for local churches.
Both, yeah. And interestingly, they point out the word koinonia fellowship is never used for a specific local church, like the fellowship in Antioch. It's always ecclesia.
Huh. Good point. And early on, these churches met where?
In homes, mostly. No special buildings until centuries later with Constantine. You could have several house churches in one city, maybe under common leaders like in Corinth.
And the key mark of who belongs to the church.
Faith. Simple as that, really. Believers is used constantly as a synonym for members. It's a community of believers. They quote 1 Peter 2.9, a chosen race, a royal priesthood.
A people belonging to God.
Exactly.
And how do you visibly join this community?
The normative way. The source's stress is baptism. That's the confirming entry point. An unbaptized believer is seen as missing that public identification with Christ and his body.
Which brings us back to that baptism party story.
Yes. Farouk and the author, 3 believers ready, weeks of teaching, talking individually. Then they go to the secluded canyon pool.
Sounds beautiful.
And the baptisms were profound, deeply meaningful.
And the false tooth.
Ah, yes, the false tooth did pop out. A real-life moment, right? Became a shared memory. But the security part is also telling.
They agreed to keep it quiet, but...
Phones were buzzing by afternoon. News travels fast when God's at work like that.
So, clear entry through faith and baptism. What about leaving?
Also clear points. Removal for serious, unrepentant sin. Abandoning the faith. Or just ceasing to be involved. Restoration is possible, obviously.
But the point is, you generally know who's part of the visible community.
Right. Being isolated isn't the ideal. It's an inferior spiritual state, as they put it.
And these local churches meet regularly. It's not just a loose connection.
No, it's active community life. Consistently spending time together, sharing life, even when it's risky, they have to find a way.
Okay, and finally, leadership.
Yeah, presented as a core structural piece. The word elders, plural, is used like 13 times for a singular local church.
Plural elders for the singular church.
Seems to be the pattern. Acts 14, Titus 1, Ephesus. Common leadership by plural elders shepherding the flock.
But no detailed constitution in the New Testament.
No, there's latitude there, but that pattern of plural eldership seems pretty consistent.
So let's tie it all back. The Great Commission. Make disciples, teach them.
And that leaves to believers living in community, which Jesus called the church.
So the goal of all that pioneer work, the how-to we started with,
Is ultimately to leave behind these kinds of communities. Believers, together, under local leaders, living out their faith, able to reproduce.
it connects the how and the what really tightly.
It really does. You need the gritty, practical steps, relationships, finding spaces, patience, but all aimed at building something that reflects the biblical core of what God wants his church to be.
So whether you, listening, are involved in this kind of planting work or supporting it, or maybe just trying to grasp what Christian community is about in any setting,
Seeing these practical steps alongside the biblical foundations is, I think, incredibly helpful.
it really highlights the intention needed, the patience, the reliance on God, on relationships,
Yeah.
all grounded in the Word.
Absolutely.
And maybe a final thought to chew on. Think about how those needs we discussed, for trust, for comfort, for a shared identity, how those shape any real community, right?
Good point. Religious or not, especially when facing pressure or bridging differences.
What does that deep human need for belonging and purpose tell us? And how, as these sources show, is it met so powerfully when people come together as God's people, the church?